There are many questions came in the question box. And not too many of them are exactly could be pleasant and music to your ears, Dr. Subramanian. Let me warn you in the beginning. But these are the questions from India and overseas who are curious about India and watching India growth story. So let me first ask you what you also mentioned, that the PLI, the Production Link Incentive Program. And I think you want to create champions, you want to grow scale. There are 13 sectors, and we are already seeing what's happening in the mobile telephone manufacturing segment. So is it something the biggest that you are betting on, the government?
So thanks a lot, Tamalda. Firstly, you're right. If you look at the PLI scheme, the idea there is not only to win up at the sectoral level, but also to incentivize growth. And let me contrast with, for instance, the earlier scheme that you emailed, the MEI, which had no incentives for growth. Now, one of the key things that we all have to remember as policy people is that the fiduciary duty of the policy maker to ensure that taxpayer money, which is a scarce resource, is put to the best use. And there's when a rupee of taxpayer money is spent on something, there is an opportunity cost to that because it could be spent elsewhere, maybe in healthcare, maybe in education, maybe in banking, or maybe in fostering exports. And therefore, I think it is extremely critical that when that taxpayer money is spent, it actually provides the right incentives. And that is what the PLI scheme involves. One, sectoral level, focusing on sectors where the potential for growth is significant, because if you look at the Indian exports configuration over the last 25 years, we've not been as much in the sunrise sectors. And I think it is extremely important to be there in those sunrise sectors, because the share of the pie that you can get is far higher. That's one idea. But second, among them as well, focus on companies that can consistently grow and thereby not only help themselves, but also the country through the export penetration.
That's what my question you have actually led to. It sounds like a bit of puzzle. On the one hand, we want exports to grow, and on the other hand, we are increasing the tariff on imports. I mean, it sounds like a puzzle. Can you explain briefly on that?
I'm glad you asked that, Tamal, because this is a question that I think comes up with, in a lot of people's minds. Here, what is important is to look at the or understand this with the nuance that is required. If you look at trade itself, and I want to first comment on the overall economic commentary on trade, and then come to the specifics and the nuances. So someone like Paul Krugman, who was a very, very passionate votary of free trade, in recent years has acknowledged that trade is not necessarily win-win. It does create losers as well. And in a democracy, we have to be pay as much attention to the needs of potential losers from free trade as the winners. And I think that nuance is something that it has been there in the policy making, but economic thinking has to reflect that as well. That's point number one. But more importantly, the second point is, when we talk about tariffs, I think it is important to make a distinction between tariffs on finished goods versus tariffs on raw materials and intermediates. And that's where I'm really going to relate it to your question. When we think about enabling exports, if we increase tariffs on raw materials and on intermediates, then that certainly is something which will actually inhibit the export, the focus on exports, on enhancing exports. But at the same time, I think, on finished goods is that it's a different story, because that is where you do not want a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old to be asked to go and actually, have let's say a kushti match with a 25-year-old. That's not necessarily fair competition. I do recognize at that time that we should not be pretending that the 5 or 10-year-old continues to always be a 5 or 10-year-old even 10 years later. We have to understand that that 5 or 10-year-old becomes a 15 or a 20-year-old, 10 years from now. But with that understanding and with that commitment, we do have to recognize that we can't let basically a 25-year-old compete with a 5-year-old. I think these nuances are very important. So I don't see any internal inconsistency in the focus on exports through the PLI scheme, and at the same time, this nuanced thinking about trade itself, about tariffs. And finally, let me mention this. WTO. If you look at the data, and one of the things that I like always focusing on, rather than expressing opinion, it's better to speak using data. If you look at the charts that recently WTO has put out, the average tariff in India has declined over the last 6-7 years. I think that is basically a fact that we have to acknowledge as well.
Thanks for the clarity. Now, you spoke about privatization. If I'm a global investor, I have been seeing India talking about privatization like IDBI Bank being taken over by LIC. It's a mockery of privatization. Can you tell me, how do you convince me that this time you are talking about real privatization?
So I think that's a very good question. It's a very apt question. So firstly, I think we must acknowledge, Tamalda, that in government documentation, the word privatization is being used for the first time. If you look at in previous occasions, even when during the Vajpayee government time, when a lot of privatization was done, the word that was used was disinvestment, not the word privatization. And if you would recall, the word privatization was used for the first time in the last year's economic survey. We had written a chapter called Privatization and Wealth Creation, and henceforth this year's budget has used that word privatization. So, and this is not just semantics, even on the semantics itself, the use of the word, apologetic word disinvestment versus the unabashed use of privatization is the first change that you have to recognize. Secondly, I think it is, it's important to keep in mind that if you look at the targets for this year, right, 1.75 trillion or 1.75 lakh crores that has been budgeted. This is actually a carryover from the estimates that were there last year. Last year, 2.1, of which the BPCL privatization, the LIC listing itself actually were important contributors. So, BPCL itself estimates, there are estimates suggesting that about 75 to 80,000 crores, or maybe even higher, can come in just from the privatization of BPCL. The LIC IPO can bring in about 1 lakh crore approximately, for instance. So these are numbers that are eminently achievable. Why? Because work had begun on many of these last year itself, and they will be completed this year. That's the second important point to keep in mind here. And finally, if you look at the speeches given by the Honorable Prime Minister, both in his thanks, address to the President's address on the floor of Parliament, where he talked about private sector, respecting private sector, about the role of privatization. He's talked about this even in some of the implementation committees on privatization and asset monetization. I would mention that, the Hindu Business Line, the day after the PM made this speech, had carried in its editorial saying watershed movement. Why? Because for the first time, the Prime Minister has actually, the Honorable Prime Minister has talked about privatization, about the role of private sector, and the fact that they bring efficiency, and that we should talk about them, we should respect them, not talk about them actually in negative overtones. I think these are all signature changes that are happening, and therefore this is not just a sporadic thing. As I already have mentioned, the change in economic thinking is actually has these three legs, of which private sector is a very critical counterpart, a part of that, and therefore I'm very, very confident that we will walk the talk.
Sure. The investors are listening, so it's not a lip service. You will walk the talk, and there's a dramatic change. The government is talking about wealth creation. Prime Minister said that government has no business to be in the business. But tell us, who's behind this change? Is it your 3 economic surveys? Should we give you that?
Well, Tamalda, I
Yeah.
think I have always maintained that economists like us can only offer advice. After offering advice, we can try and persuade. We can work hard on that. But I think the ultimate decision is taken by the decision makers. They are the ones that have to also take into account all the whatever pushback that comes to them, and quite rightly, therefore all the credit has to go to them. I think decision making, especially in a democratic polity, is something that is not that easy. I've had the opportunity to see it from from very close proximity, and therefore the credit has to go to the policymaker, to the decision makers who actually taken these decisions. I must say I'm very glad to actually see some of these ideas being implemented, but the credit has to completely go to these decision makers.
That's fair. That's fair. I don't think you can take credit, but you yourself can't. But we give you the credit for the change in the mindset. Quickly, because we are half the time we have spent, and I have few more questions, and they're all critical ones. People want to know. Tell me what's your take on the long-term growth story? You have been talking about 8%, but people are not convinced. They said 5%. That's good enough.
So let me, I'm going to give a little bit of a long answer to this, Tamalda, because I need to get into some details here.
I have many more questions, so chota.
Yeah, but I think this is possibly the most important question. So, see, if you look at the budget, and let me use the framework of, if you take growth rate, right? Growth rate, macroeconomists think about that as the gross fixed capital formation in the country multiplied by the ICOR, the incremental capital output ratio. And if you look at the steps that have been taken, they impact both of them, which is the gross fixed capital formation in the country and the incremental capital output ratio, which is just a measure for productivity. I think we've spoken about many of this. The economic survey, the second chapter this year, talked about how public, capital expenditure crowds in private investment. And if you look at the, and recent data, for instance, if you look at the CEIC estimates on investment sentiment, or the RBI's business expectation survey, we are at, some of these numbers are suggesting we are at a 20-year peak in terms, or high in terms of the investment sentiment. And recall what I spoke about on the virtuous cycle, that the start of an uptick in the business cycle always gets originated from private investment. So I think gross fixed capital formation in the economy will go up, certainly, and can in a few years start getting close to the 40%, 38, 39% that we had earlier, because of the focus on infrastructure, because of the focus on capex, and the enablers that have been done through the DFI, the Development Financial Institution, both in the public sector and the private sector, and the financial sector reforms, because capital is extremely important for capital formation in the economy. Similarly, if you look at on the productivity side, we've already spoken about privatization, about asset monetization. What asset monetization does is, idle assets, those that are not getting used in the economy, are brought into use in the economy. So they will improve the productivity, and thereby actually also, lower the ICOR. So when you think about actually the growth rate is because of improvements, or improvements in productivity and improvements in the gross fixed capital formation in the country. I am I'm quite optimistic that going forward from FY23 onwards, FY23 likely will be at 6.5%, but we will be hitting the upward trend and going towards 7.5%, 8%. Because even on the productivity side, the measures that are being taken on healthcare, and on many of the other economies of scale, some of the reforms that we spoke about, labor reforms, the change in MSME definitions, all these will come together and push both your gross fixed capital formation and the and the productivity in the economy. So I am quite optimistic. I think that the 5% is something that we should easily be able to hit over the next decade, quite likely 7% plus.
Okay, so people are listening to you, not 5%, 7% plus. Say 2022 fiscal year definitely will have a growth because of the low base effect. But tell me, people have been talking about after that. There are people like, and this is very contradictory what I am going to say. Ajay would not like this because this is this afternoon we are talking about India's decade. But I am asking you a blunt question. Do you have any, I mean, there are people are talking about it could be a decade of stagflation, low growth and high inflation. Is there any merit in this kind of thinking, or they are the naysayers?
I think, Tamal, I've already outlined the economic rationale that makes me say what I'm saying. As I've emphasized repeatedly, I give my assessments based on data using economic frameworks. And I think, it's quite likely, I don't think any of us is an astrologer that can, predict for sure. But, when you make assessments using conceptual frameworks, think ab initio and bring data to actually, to throw light on important questions like these, it's much more likely that, what we are predicting will manifest, compared to just sort of an opinion which is not well grounded in economic theory or with data. So, as I've already explained to you, I don't foresee this possibility of stagflation. Once again, let me mention FY22, of course, because of the base effect, the growth should be in double digits. FY23, I think it could be 6.5%, because some of the impact of the reforms will still be manifesting, would not have fully manifested by FY23. But beyond that, I think a lot of these long run measures that we have taken will start bearing fruit, and therefore it's quite likely that the gross fixed capital formation will go up and your productivity will also go up in the economy. So it's important to understand it's finally capital formation times productivity that basically leads to growth. So I actually am convinced, because of the thinking that is leading to this prediction. I'm sure, on macroeconomics, people will always have, a lot of intelligent people may disagree, but I would like to stick to my assessment based on the rationale that I gave you.
And you don't apprehend any kind of fiscal crisis for us?
So I'm glad you asked this. So, in the second chapter in the economic survey, we dealt at length. That's a chapter that had about 16,000 words. I'm just bringing it up because typically, and just sharing a secret, I would keep 10,000 words as a benchmark for chapters in the survey. But this one I felt actually so important. We need to actually bring in all the analysis. And the basic idea there is, let me explain it in the following way. Suppose I borrow 100 rupees from Jana Bank, and I pay, let's say, an 8% rate of interest. I invested in a venture that gives me 12%, as the return, let's say. So, and just for simplicity, let's say this is a 1-year loan. At the end of the year, I have to repay to Jana 108 rupees because I've borrowed at 8%. But because I've made 112 rupees, I can pocket 4 rupees, I can borrow another 100 rupees, and I can continue this as long as the return that I'm making is actually greater than the interest that I'm that I'm paying for the borrowing that I'm doing. Now, take this simple example and translate it into the macro scenario. What you're talking about is the difference between the nominal rate of growth and the nominal rate of borrowing, what is called the R minus G. So R is your nominal rate of interest, G is your nominal rate of growth. You can do it either in nominal terms or in real terms, as long as you're comparing apples and apples, not apples and oranges. In India, if you look historically, and we've shown this data, the R minus G differential has been about minus 4.2%. In other words, nominal growth rate has been about 4% at least greater than the rate of interest. And what we have done is we've actually projected this in the, and those who are worried about debt sustainability should definitely go and take a look at this, because, it's important to understand the difference between flows and stocks. Fiscal deficit, primary deficit, those are flow variables. Your debt to GDP is a stock variable. and the R minus G differential eventually impacts basically your stock, which is debt to GDP. And why do you care about the debt to GDP? Because how much of your GDP do you need to actually repay your debt? That's what basically the debt to GDP captures. And the key point I'm making here is that as long as the nominal rate of growth is higher than the nominal rate of interest or the borrowing, and by the way, interest costs are completely incorporated into this identity. It's a mathematical identity. It's a tautology, and the derivation for that is also provided in a box in the economic survey. When you take into account endogenously the interest costs and then find that the growth rate is greater than the rate of interest, debt will come down. And what we've shown there is even with 3.8% real growth, 3.8% every year starting from now on up until FY30. Mark the scenario that I'm pointing out. Every year starting from now, from FY20, 23 onwards till FY30, 3.8% real growth only. Even if we have that, debt will remain sustainable. Now, from there, you can project actually all other scenarios are only better than.
I have been able to provoke you, so thanks for that. Quickly, we are running out of time. I have a few more questions, 2 or 3. And the 2-3 critical things that that one can expect from the government in the next 16-18 months. Quickly, we are just one-line answers. Just want.
I think implementation is what is the most important. Right now, the focus is on implementing the several ideas that have been brought out. I think that has to be the #1 priority at this point in time. The privatization agenda, the asset monetization agenda, the infrastructure pipeline, these have to be the banking sector, all the reforms, your bad bank, your privatization of the 2 public sector banks, the insurance, and traction has already begun on that, even the DFI. So the implementation of these has to be the most important at this point in time, because we have actually announced a very ambitious agenda. And I think, implementing that is by far the most critical.
I'm sure everybody would agree with you. Quickly, I can't let you go before this. This inflation targeting, it's 5-year is over, next 5-year, and it's more or less certain that we will stick to 4% inflation, flexible inflation target by RBI with a plus minus 2 percentage point band. But globally things are changing. US are talking about average inflation. Past decade was -2, now it's talking about +2. Do you think we are sort of obsessed with this inflation targeting? Because anyway, our retail inflation 50% weightage is from food, and every time onion prices, tomato prices go up, RBI goes to the drawing board. So is there anything needs to be changed, you think, quickly?
So quickly, 2 points, Tamalda. One, if you look at the evidence, I think not only do we need to look at inflation levels, but in volatility of inflation. I think overall, inflation targeting has helped in bringing the volatility of inflation and level of inflation down. But what is important to keep in mind is that when there are supply side factors that cause inflation, and a lot of it is coming from the food economy, that is something that we have to be a little careful about, because monetary policy can primarily influence demand. And so, I think it ideally should not be responding as much to the supply side factors.
Okay, that's a message. I'm not a message. That's a statement I'm sure RBI is listening to or would listen to. And finally, I can't let you go before this question, is because it's a banking summit. I mean, rather an event organized by a bank, small finance bank. Tell me your one-line answer. Indian economy, does it need more banks or lesser number of banks?
Lot more banks. Lot more banks. Just, I'll give you a quick comparison. The United States, which has, 1/3 the population of India, has about 25,000 banks, 25,000 to 30,000 banks. Do the per capita comparison. You will get, again, based on evidence, why I'm convinced that we need to have a lot more banks.
Thank you.